Hello everyone, I'm Mike Amerlin. I work on the Office Ecosystem Marketing team, focusing on how you can build great solutions on top of Office 365. And today we're going to talk about SharePoint development in the enterprise. I'm going to talk about everything you can do to customize SharePoint in Office 365 and on-premises environments, and build things like pages, document libraries, and other types of applications using all of the ingredients of SharePoint. Now, before working on Office Ecosystem Marketing, I worked as a program manager on the SharePoint team. So, I've developed a number of different capabilities across SharePoint, but, at no other time in the history of SharePoint has it been a better time to start creating new content and new code on top of SharePoint. We have a range of great options that leverage your web skills to build great solutions for SharePoint. So in this session, what we're going to cover is the set of scenarios that we think and we see developers building with SharePoint, the kinds of scenarios that maybe you're already building today in your enterprise or your business, and also maybe some food for thought on different ways that you can leverage everything that you have with SharePoint. And along the way, we'll also talk about a number of different technologies that are used to implement SharePoint solutions, including things like SharePoint Framework for your web presentations, Microsoft Graph for actually connecting to SharePoint data, and then we'll talk a bit about Flow and webhooks as a way to respond to changes that happen inside of SharePoint. Now, we're going to cover everything that's been new and happening in the past 6 months to a year, as well as what's coming in the near-term future for SharePoint development. So, let's go drill into that. Now, when you think about building things with SharePoint, I think the thing that probably comes to mind the most is building intranet pages. These are sites for your teams, for your departments, and within SharePoint today, we have a new, great engaging way to build web pages using team sites and communication sites. And so frequently, it's a task for developers to go ahead and further customize those sites to add new custom components called web parts to those pages, as well as tailor the look and feel of those pages to make sure that they match, the desired expectations of the teams that are using them. So frequently, end users will create pages inside of SharePoint, they'll customize them, they'll add web parts, but as a developer, you'll want to go further and actually create custom web parts to get to that last mile of customization that your users expect. It's another frequent task to integrate tools and different experiences into SharePoint. SharePoint's the hub of content, things like files in a company. And so being able to integrate new tools like, for example, e-signature solutions like Adobe Sign or other types of tools that integrate with those content, that can pull them out, that can push them in, that can extend the menus as you see here. Another very common task in developing with SharePoint. Processes and workflows are a way that developers have for actually responding to changes inside of SharePoint as documents change. So frequently, for example, somebody will want to have a document library where all of their process workflows come in and all of their documents, and they'll want to add a custom and deep workflow on top of that to respond to the way that you expect users to interact with documents inside of your team. So you can start by using tools like Flow, and of course there's a number of third-party workflow tools as well, but sometimes you want to go hook into the actual lower level, into the webhooks to respond to changes inside of document libraries to build out those custom flows. It's another very common scenario in developing with SharePoint. And then finally, we see a lot of developers building business applications using the ingredients of SharePoint. So SharePoint has a lot of facilities that we'll talk about, but you can build complete business applications from scratch using SharePoint. So let's talk a little bit about that business application scenario. Why would you want to build your application on top of SharePoint? Well, first, it comes with infrastructure every app needs. So, things like a SharePoint list, it's kind of like a little bit of a relational database table. Of course, it's got nowhere near all the facilities of a database table, but it does have concepts like structured storage, list relationships, and the ability to query lists. They're also tailored for and by teams. So every facet of the SharePoint experience can be edited by teams to allow them to customize and go ahead and tailor the experience, add some custom columns, create a SharePoint page, create a web part view onto them. So after you build your solution, if you want to make some subtle tweaks to it, if you want to improve the look and feel of it, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go back and crack the code and ship a new version of your software. Because it's designed to be tailored, teams can come in and they can actually customize the experience. SharePoint has a rich set of APIs, and we'll talk about those, but key facets are exposed through Microsoft Graph, and there's a rich developer experience around it through tools like the SharePoint Framework. And then finally, SharePoint is built on Office 365. So the benefit of that means that you get all of the compliance features and security features, the different compliance standards that Office 365 adheres to. Those will apply to your solution generally. so that you're really building on a very trusted foundation, that you already probably have deployed inside of your organization. So for all those reasons, in addition to those portal scenarios and those process scenarios, you might consider building new business applications from scratch using the ingredients of SharePoint. Now, SharePoint does have a lot of ingredients that will hopefully boost your development. So we have lists. So lists, as I mentioned, were those structured storage mechanisms that you could use to do filters and queries and those kinds of things. Now, when you store files in a list, that's called a document library. And those document libraries have additional features like, for example, versioning and check-in and check-out so that you can use them to power your flows. Things like a recycle bin. So sometimes when you're building a custom application, what happens if a user accidentally deletes something? Well, with a recycle bin in SharePoint, when you delete a list item, it'll go into the recycle bin and you have the opportunity to restore it later in case someone made a mistake. And so that's functionality you'll get for free, so to speak, if you're building your application with SharePoint lists and libraries. It's a kind of a handy feature sometimes that might be a good savior, perhaps. You can also export list data to Excel, so that's a handy way to let people do some further data analysis on SharePoint list items. And then other tools like search and page hosting and list views. All these kinds of tools are, again, free components, if you will, that will, help you out in building your projects if you're choosing to build them on top of SharePoint. Now, from an API and developer tools perspective, as I mentioned, we have a rich API exposed through Microsoft Graph. Now, as we'll talk about, Microsoft Graph, connects you across Office 365 and beyond to allow you to have one simple endpoint for accessing data, not just in SharePoint, but for things like, email data or calendar data or people data. And, SharePoint now has a rich API exposed through SharePoint. You can also connect things like Azure Functions and Microsoft Flow to SharePoint data. So for those business processes, you can use all of the strength of Azure to go build and extend those experiences. And Microsoft Flow has over 150, I think it's now 200 connectors that allow you to connect different systems together with your process and information into Microsoft Flow. And then finally, as we'll talk about, SharePoint Framework is a way to actually develop custom page experiences using modern JavaScript tools. So when you think about the SharePoint developer landscape, we have this, three-stage diagram where, it starts with the data and APIs in SharePoint. SharePoint has lists and libraries and sites infrastructure. And so there's a set of APIs that you can use to access them. There's a logic layer that sits on top of it, and common tools for working with that logic layer are things like webhooks and Flow and remote event receivers. And then finally, there's a user experience layer on top of SharePoint. So some tools you'll use there are SharePoint Framework, add-ins, and extensions. And also Power Apps are another way to actually extend the user experience of SharePoint in a more no-code type fashion that doesn't require you to write individual lines of codes. So you can see how you have got this data and API layer, probably using Graph APIs or some REST or some CSOM APIs, logic and user experience all working together to help you build an application. Now, every application has a need to deploy it, so there's a number of different tools that allow you to take all of those facets and those that you're pulling together and actually package them and then offer them to your users and offer them to your administrators to go deploy, including things like a content delivery network set of support, an application packaging mechanism, and we have something called add-ins as well that allow you to package in your existing sites and applications and expose them through our store so that they can get access to a broader audience beyond your company and beyond your organization. So let's start by actually talking about the user experience first. That's something where there's been a lot of investment and a lot of change in SharePoint, and we're really rolling out new modern experiences that you can integrate with your developer web-based skills. So let's go ahead and get started and talk about the user experience. Now, first, inside of SharePoint, we have a new authoring canvas that's available for developers to create what we call modern pages. So the goal behind this page is that you have what you see is what you get type of authoring. You can drag and drop different components, web parts, and those kinds of things into the page. There's layout flexibility, so things like multi-column sections. You can do things like drag and drop. And then we also have something called web parts, which are basically these building blocks of those pages. And out of the box, we have a number of different web parts, things like a hero controller, an image control, and the ability to display PowerPoint slides that are available to you as a page author. So let's go take a look at that. So if I come to my SharePoint site that you see here, what you can see is I'm going to click on Site Contents. This is my adventure equipment site where we're doing a lot of tracking of adventure equipment in our Contoso Adventure company. And you'll see straight from the menu here, there is an option for creating a new page. So when I do this, I'm taken to the new modern page experience. And so the idea behind this is to make it, as easy to create a web page in SharePoint as it is to create a PowerPoint slide. I can give this page a title, maybe status or something like that. And then when you see below this is a web part picker. And so there's a number of different options here that I can use to design my page. I can add text, so I can add some simple hello world text inline. Again, it's what you see is what you get, so I can highlight and select some content and say hello world. And of course, then you can also add images and the like, as separate web parts beneath it. But then there's also this library of web parts that are now available as well. So you can do things, let me scroll down. You can do things like add, for example, images or highlighted content web parts. So the highlighted content web part, as a case in point, what that does is it'll take documents that you have been working on that are relevant to you and show them automatically in your site. So there's these smart web parts that will show you relevant content. And then in addition, you'll see other things like we have a new set of connectors, so you can actually connect in data from data sources like GitHub. And then you can also do things like add hero web part. So the hero web part is, kind of a common fixture on websites. It's this sort of main set of images that, is really engaging that you can add to your site. And again, just to show you the idea, I can say select link. That will take me to a nice, web page selection experience. I can select that. And I can do things like edit the look and feel of this and select an image. And also do other types of customization. Now, when I select that, what's going to happen is a property pane comes up. This is our toolbox for letting you actually go ahead and edit different types of web parts and customize those properties. So this is the modern page experience. When I'm done, I can just hit publish. And so now you'll see my site, my page is ready to go and available for everyone to go see. Of course, I can do a lot more to add pages and colors to make it more engaging, and of course add more content as well. But you get the idea. Simple, easy to create, just a couple clicks and you're done. So as a developer, you can go ahead and extend those web parts, as I mentioned. We have a web part picker that has a lot of out-of-the-box web parts, as I mentioned. We have search controls and a new toolbox. And we also have this concept of connectors. So that connection, for example, to GitHub data, there's a connector that will pull in GitHub notifications and automatically channel them into your SharePoint site. And you can also, if you're building SharePoint add-ins, and SharePoint add-ins give you a way to take existing websites and existing applications that you're hosting external to SharePoint and then frame them into SharePoint, you can also see those as well inside of the web part toolbox. But the interesting thing is that as a developer, you can build your own web parts using something called the SharePoint framework. So the SharePoint framework really is focused on letting you use JavaScript and modern client-side development, specifically TypeScript as a derivative of JavaScript, to go build new engaging web parts inside of SharePoint. Now, it's designed to be lightweight and easy and make it possible for you to bring your existing web developer skills and the frameworks that things like Angular or React, to go develop custom web parts inside of SharePoint. Now, these SharePoint mobile pages are also designed, or these modern SharePoint pages are also designed to work on mobile. So, I showed it to you on a desktop, but you can imagine seeing those web pages on a mobile device in the browser. And we also have a SharePoint mobile application, and SharePoint Framework is designed to support that. We use SharePoint pages and SharePoint Framework, throughout our modern experiences as well. So you're leveraging all of the sort of the testing and the sort of learning that we do as we build out our own first-party experiences. It's designed to sort of better support you through the lifecycle of a web part. So as SharePoint updates and changes, the web parts that you build today, we're working to make sure that those continue to work moving forward in a robust fashion. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, the idea behind this is to let you use your open source tools and web frameworks that and bring them into SharePoint and then go develop with them. So we're trying to make sure that it's as comfortable as possible if you've been doing a lot of JavaScript coding, things with coding with TypeScript, coding with React, to bring that into SharePoint and feel like you can be productive immediately. Now, if you're, have been working with SharePoint from before, you've been doing maybe some ASP.NET coding, which is the previous way that you would build web parts and extend them inside of SharePoint. You may be this may be the first time you're sort of really experiencing modern web development, But never fear. The idea is that for every sort of .NET technology that you might be familiar with, there is a sort of TypeScript or JavaScript, type of coding equivalent. And so, for example, when I got started coding this about a year and a half ago, it was all foreign to me in terms of all these different technologies, the logo soup of Node.js and NPM and TypeScript. But I think if you analogize it to the different types of tools you'd use for building ASP.NET web parts, you'll find that for your actual runtime environment for debugging, we use Node.js, and ordinarily you would have used .NET. For your packaging mechanisms, in scripting, you're going to use NPM, not as compared to NuGet. Your coding language, as compared to C#, typically you'd be using TypeScript. Gulp is going to be your packaging and build execution system. And Yeoman will provide you some tools and templates to go ahead and get you started for building custom components. So again, I would encourage you, to do what I did, which is, kind of just dive in, build your first SharePoint Framework web part, build your first SharePoint Framework extension. Even if you're not necessarily familiar with all the technologies, it can be a great way to learn all of these things and come up to speed. So let's talk a little bit about that concept of SharePoint Framework business applications. Up on GitHub, on SharePoint, you'll find that we have a number of new solutions that are intended to be end-to-end solutions that you can take advantage of. And so let's just go take a look at some of those. So I'm going to come back to my SharePoint site, and what you'll see here is if I go back to home, go back to my home page, you'll see that I've got a web part page here, but there's a number of interesting web parts that implement applications. And so in this case, what you're seeing is I've got a set of checked out items, for tracking the inventory that we have of Adventure equipment, and there's sort of a set of, equipment in general. And in fact, when I click on these, you'll see that there's a simple user experience for editing these. So in my case, what I can do is I can say, okay, this internal in this internal backpack, I can change the location and the description, things like that. And if I want to, I can also check it out for myself, and I can say, I'm ready to take this out, so it's checked out by me. And the scheduled checkout date is going to be, in April, and that's when I expect to check it in. And I can say I want to check out one of these and hit save. And so in doing this, now I've done a very simple checkout system, and now it's sort of checked out to me. Now, if you look at the how this is implemented behind the scenes, it's this idea of a SharePoint business application. So what I'm using behind the scenes is 2 SharePoint lists to actually implement that concept of an inventory list. So here I have a set of items which reflects the set of different inventory things that are available in those descriptions. And then I've got a separate SharePoint list for actually tracking the checkouts. So as users go ahead and check out individual items, that gets tracked in a SharePoint list. So just to give you an idea of using different SharePoint components here, SharePoint lists as building blocks for your own SharePoint solutions. So this is my SharePoint list. I can go and edit this and export it to Excel, and you'll see the details about who's checked it out and similar things like that. So this is just a very simple concept. I'm using a SharePoint Framework web part here. If you look at the code, this is in Visual Studio Code. You'll see that it implements a pattern that we have for these kinds of web parts. It starts with a TypeScript control that you see here. So go drill into that really quickly. Sorry. Here's my web part control. And so this is kind of where it all begins, is my web part control. And so this implements a common base class interface called base client-side web part. And then there's a couple of functions here for when the web part gets initialized, when it goes ahead and renders, and when it does things like implements a property pane for configuring the web part. Now this code, what it'll do is it'll instantiate React. React is a JavaScript framework library that allows me to implement different components and put them together, kind of like XAML. You have a markup language for describing how the components fit together, and behind the scenes you have a library of components that implement different facets. So in my case, there's a component here called inventory list. This is a React component. Again, you can think of it almost like a XAML control, just in TypeScript. And I've got a constructor here in TypeScript for defining the functionality. And the way that React works is that you actually can mix and match JavaScript code or TypeScript code along with your markup straight inside of the component, so you can really change how it looks and feels and responds to different types of state changes in the actual component. So just a whirlwind tour of how this web part was implemented. But what you can see here is that we have a number of different markup elements that come together along with inline code to really make you super productive for building these new types of React components. Okay, now One of the great things about working with SharePoint is there's such a strong community and so many of you out there that are building really rich and robust components that sort of help feed others' solutions. So, for example, a number of organizations are already using different types of SharePoint components, whether it be for provisioning, whether it be for different types of controls. And of course, there's a whole library of samples implemented for you as well to provide inspiration. And of course, because it's open source and on GitHub, you can also make pull requests. You can also file issues. And through the community, we can really jumpstart your productivity. So if you haven't taken a look yet, go to http://aka.ms/sppnp, and you'll see sort of all the collected sets of tools and resources that we have for you. And it's going to be a great way for you to get started with SharePoint development because you'll find probably a sample for something close to what you're looking to do, or for that uses a framework that you're more familiar with that gives you kind of a guideline as to how you can take your frameworks and use them. There's just a library of samples that are available for you. And of course, we also have a number of partners building with SharePoint Framework as well. So Valo builds custom intranet portals, and they're building on top of SharePoint Framework as their fundamental way to get web parts and designable elements into their portal products. And Palo 365 is also doing the same as well for their Palo communication and team sites. So just to give you an idea of how other different partners and software vendors are building new solutions using SharePoint Framework. Now, SharePoint Framework itself has had a rapid release cadence over the past year. Now, as you can see, we had a lot of updates around a beta timeframe, and then ultimately we had a release that happened in early last year where it was made available for everyone to actually start building on top of SharePoint Framework. Now, over the past year, we've been expanding and adding new functionality to SharePoint Framework to expand the set of things that you can do with it, and we'll talk about those. Just a number of different things. So first among these was the idea that you can now use SharePoint Framework in on-premises environments. So with Feature Pack 2, you can actually now bring those SharePoint Framework web parts that you may be building to on-premises environments. You just deploy Feature Pack 2. There's a version of SharePoint Framework 1.1, and that level of support is what you can use and bring into SharePoint Server 2016. But the beauty of this is that it allows you to have one code base that targets both on-premises and online environments. So check that out. Next up, we have SharePoint Framework Extensions. So, in addition to web parts, you can now also extend various facets of the SharePoint user experience. So to do this, you have a number of different customizers or things that you can extend. First among these is an application customizer, which allows you to extend and override the user experience of SharePoint. We have a command set, which allows you to add new custom menu options to SharePoint command surfaces. And then there's also a field customizer, which allows you to go ahead and change the presentation of data inside of a list view. So let's go show you what that looks like. So I'm going to come back over to my SharePoint site. I'm going to go over to my, I've got a portal here for all the different adventures that our company is scheduling and planning. And so when I come here, what you'll see is if I go to the top of the page, you can see that there's a status bar. And so what the status window has is a set of options for going ahead and seeing maybe some announcements and maybe an overall status of things that are going on. So in this adventures user experience, you can see this is a list for tracking all the adventures that we have going on. And so what you can see here is that there's a column here that when I click it, what it'll do is it'll open up a brief Bing Maps preview of the different options that you can see here. So I can see the location where this adventure is being planned, and I can work with a map there. This is a custom field customizer that I've used on this particular list. The other thing about this is I've also customized the command surfaces. So each adventure has an option to go publish this adventure out to the public through our website. Now, when I click this, what will happen is that I get a dialog that pops up. This dialog is powered through JavaScript so that you can go ahead and customize the exact experience that you want when somebody actually clicks on your menu option. And when I click publish this adventure, what it would do behind the scenes is go publish it to my custom blog publishing system or something like that. But this just gives you an idea of the possibilities for more deeply extending SharePoint by letting you customize the fields, add new menu options, and adding a customizer and sort of a bit of custom user experience at the top of my SharePoint page. So let's go take a look at how that's built. So I'm going to show you sort of a bit of an end-to-end of how you build one of these. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and create a new directory, C Travel X, like that. I'm going to create a new directory and go into it. And I'm going to use yo@Microsoft/SharePoint. So we're going to build our first SharePoint Framework extension, but this is a very similar process for actually building a SharePoint Framework web part. So if you're not familiar with that, it's going to be very familiar. Now, when I click that at Microsoft/SharePoint option, it's using a tool called Yeoman. And so Yeoman's basically project scaffolding. So what it'll do is it'll ask me some questions on what's the name of your solution. Do you want to target SharePoint 2016 or sort of the latest and greatest in SharePoint Online? I'll choose that option. I'll want to use the current folder. There's an option around, do I want to support tenant administration? And then finally, I can choose whether I want to go build a web part or extension. And then I can choose what kind of extension I want to go build. Give it a final name and a description. And so what this is going to do, it's going to go pull down different packages and different sets of resources that I can use to get my project started. Now this part can take 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, so it'll take a little bit of a while. I'm not going to go ahead and wait for it. I'm just going to go to a project where I already have that created. So now this is my project, and you can see it's created a number of folders. It's created a starter source, where all of my code to start with will be located. And I can go ahead and get started from here. I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code, which is a great editor for editing SharePoint Framework projects, but of course you can use your own projects as well. So in this case, you can see that what it's done is it's created a new extension called Hello World. There's a JSON file here which describes some of the metadata of my extension. And there's a TypeScript file here which actually implements the JavaScript source of my customizer. So this is my application customizer called Hello World. And you can see that there's an onInit function which will basically just display an alert. Now to test this, what you're going to want to do is actually build a custom URL that allows you to test it. So I actually have a template here. I'm just going to put it into Notepad. And there's instructions for putting this together inside of the site. And we're working towards tooling improvements to make this easier. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the identifier of this customizer and paste it into my debugging URL. So I'm going to put that there, like so. And so then I'm going to come to my website and open up a new tab, like so. And so what this is going to do is it's going to start up my SharePoint Framework document library page and actually say, do you want to load debug scripts? And so that's going to allow my custom application customizer extension to run. Actually, though, it's not going to run because I have not run gulp serve yet. Gulp is the build engine that we have that basically will take all those TypeScript files and all those different resources and package them together, crunch the JavaScript, do all kinds of lint checks to make sure that it's going to compile successfully and those kinds of things. So I need to run this first, then I need to come back over into my experience, that URL that I just opened. So let me try this one more time. Okay, say load debug scripts, like so. And so now I've got my alert that says hello from my application customizer. So now I've been able to actually run custom JavaScript on my page when it comes in. Now, when you deploy the solution, you won't have to use these funky URLs and all that kind of fun stuff. This is just a debug experience. But this just shows you how it's possible to build an application customizer that extends your page. Now let's just do something slightly more interesting with that solution. I'm going to come back into my TypeScript file, and I'm just going to add a couple things. So I don't want to just run JavaScript on the page. I want to customize and extend it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I want to override a content placeholder with some custom content that I have. Now, the next thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to go download some content from the internet. So I've got this onInit function, which will go call a web service that I'm hosting with some JSON information about classes. And then once that response returns, it's going to go call render placeholders, which will actually take a spot on the page and add some HTML into it, which we'll see. And then let me get rid of this function, this old onInit. And then finally, this is my render placeholders function. And what this is going to do is it's going to say, get the SharePoint context, get the placeholder provider, and try to go find the top of the page. This may fail, if the page isn't fully rendered yet. But when you get that top placeholder, what I want you to do is actually take the class data that you've retrieved from my web service and then go put it into my page. So this is just a very basic hello world, let's go render something into the page example. I'm going to go hit save. Now Gulp automatically picks up that save and automatically recompiles my project. So if I come back to my browser instance over here, like so, and refresh the page, what you'll see is that it's going to say, do you want to debug scripts? I'll say yes, load debug scripts. And now it says beginning whitewater rafting, the name of my class at the top of my page. Now I can do one more last minute thing to go improve the look and feel of this. And so I'm doing a little bit of a shortcut here. It's a little bit of a developer shortcut. avert your eyes. It's not the cleanest of code, but what you can see here is that now I'm going to just render a little bit more custom HTML. And so if I come back to this page and hit refresh, say yes to loading debug scripts, now you can see it's got a little bit more of a presentation similar to what you saw earlier. So you can see how you can actually go ahead and get started and extend facets of the page with an application customizer. I showed you a little bit of how you could use TypeScript and a little bit of the experience of using SharePoint Framework, using tools like Gulp and Yeoman to get started and to go compile your projects. So that's SharePoint Framework extensions and how you can get started with that. Okay, so now let's talk about other ways you can extend SharePoint. So both across OneDrive for Business and SharePoint, we have this concept of file handlers. So file handlers allow you to add different extensions in a similar way to those custom command set extensions I just showed you, but across file types across your OneDrive and SharePoint instances. So the benefit of this is, for example, for a given file type, like let's say PDF or other different extensions, you can go ahead and add custom menu options as you see here to go launch your own custom applications, your own websites, and integrate with the experience of OneDrive and SharePoint and files for them. So it's just another way to go add new custom actions to documents across Office 365. Now, the other thing that we've also been working to add is a number of improvements to SharePoint Framework. So now, for example, we have application lifecycle management API so that your IT team or you as developers or whomever can actually now automatically deploy new solutions into SharePoint through the app catalog and out to your SharePoint sites. So you can build more sophisticated deployment mechanisms that make it easier for you to get your custom code all the way into the hands of the users through newly available application lifecycle management APIs. We also now support tenant-wide deployment. So you can either deploy a SharePoint Framework solution or an add-in specifically to a particular site. You can add it there. Or you can more broadly sort of make it available across your entire Office 365 tenancy. So if you've got a web part that you want every site to be able to have access to and to be able to use, you can go ahead and select tenant-wide deployment as an administrator when you deploy it, and it'll become automatically available everywhere where there's a web part picker. Now there is one restriction. There's a capability of SharePoint Framework to include things like list-based resources. And when you do a tenant-wide deployment, you can't also use those list-based resources that come with your SharePoint Framework web part. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there that you can read more about in the tenant deployment documentation. Now, the Yeoman Generator, as you saw, was our tool for actually getting projects started. You answer some questions and it automatically downloads different scripts and allows you to go from there. We've been updating that tool set with new options to support all the different new features of SharePoint Framework. So, for example, you can build packages for cloud or on-premises. There's some options around whether you want to support tenant-wide deployment or not. And one of the really interesting things is something called asset packaging. So with asset packaging, what you can do is you can now take all those JavaScript resources and all the CSS and all the images that you're going to package together, and you can actually put them into your SharePoint Framework package so that when an administrator deploys it, it will automatically update an Office 365 public CDN with those resources. So you don't have to worry about taking all the JavaScript you're writing and hosting it yourself. You can just put it all together into your package and let Office 365 do all of the work for you. So this dramatically simplifies the process of putting together packages and getting them over to your administrator counterparts. So it's definitely a really great feature that's now newly available inside of SharePoint Framework. There's also now a site-specific app catalog. So we talked about tenant deployment. I want to make my web part available everywhere. But if you want to make a web part specifically only available to a particular site, like maybe your portal site, you can go ahead and select a site-specific app catalog. You can then go ahead and upload your SharePoint Framework solution just to that, and rest assured that it will only be used inside of that SharePoint site collection specifically. So this is useful for things like a portal where you've got just one site where you're bringing together all kinds of assets and you don't want those web parts just visible or even the solutions visible in other sites as well. And we're also working towards new functionality that's out and available in preview that will be, that you can start working with today. So you can actually call Microsoft Graph directly from SharePoint Framework web parts. And so there's new support to make that easy for you to go do. So go research that. And we're also, integrating new ways to actually customize the provisioning process and the site designing experience so that as users create new sites, if you want a standard customization to apply to it, you can go look at that as well and see how you can actually have very tailored sites made available to all of your users by default. Now let's go drill into the SharePoint data and APIs and go drill down to the opposite side and talk about how you can actually customize SharePoint. So as I mentioned, one of the major ways that you can actually work with Office 365 is through Microsoft Graph APIs. So this provides one endpoint where you can access a diverse array of data, and SharePoint now has new sites and list APIs that you can access in there as well. So let's talk about the Microsoft Graph. Let me go show you what that looks like. So if I come over here, there's something called Graph Explorer. And if you haven't had a chance to play with this, you definitely should go to graph.microsoft.com. You'll be navigated to a different set of resources and tools that are available to you. And one of them is something called the Graph Explorer. So Microsoft Graph starts with being a REST API. And as a REST API, it supports all the standard semantics around if you want to go read data, you make a GET request to a particular HTTP endpoint. In this case, if I want to read profile information about myself, you can call a GET on graph.microsoft.com/v1.0/me, and you'll get that kind of information here. If you want to do things like update it, you can do so. Now, by default, when you come to Graph Explorer, it'll have some sample data that you can't edit. But if you sign in with your Microsoft account, you can actually use, Microsoft. You can use your own sort of Office 365 account to go get started and actually mock out how you might want to connect to Office 365. Now, we have an Office 365 developer program that's on dev.office.com if you look for developer program. And the benefit of this, one of the benefits of this is that it actually has a way for you to get your own Office 365 developer test tenancy. So if you're going to do extensive development with Office 365, I absolutely recommend go into the developer program, get yourself a tenancy so that you can experiment with it with confidence that you're not going to sort of maybe mess up your own personal profile and those kinds of things. So in this case, I'm working with my test tenancy, and you can see that I'm going to get information about myself, and you have things like your job title and your information. And as I mentioned, you can also do things like post or put or patch data. Now, in my case, there's a number of different, sample sets here. This is about profile information, but you can also see different samples that we have available on the site to work with. So you can work with Excel data. You can work with things like OneNote, a number of other different cases as well. Now, in my case, we want to show you a little bit of, working with SharePoint sites and lists. So let's go customize that. And so now you can see a set of samples for working with your SharePoint sites. And so if you want to get started with SharePoint sites, you just call /sites/root. And what this will do is it'll retrieve information about the root site of your SharePoint site collection that's in Office 365. And so here it's just going to return some very basic metadata of when it was created. If you want to enumerate the set of document libraries, again, you can go enumerate that, and it'll return all the libraries that are available in your site. Okay, so there's a number of other different APIs here. You can also get things like the content types that are deployed in the site, key information. You can do simple searches, to search your site by a particular keyword. So /site/search equals Contoso, and you can go look for all the sites that mention Contoso and go from there. Now, lists, as I've mentioned, is a key building block of SharePoint sites. And so now there's a full API for enumerating the set of lists in your site that you can work with. And so you can get started by simply saying, give me the root site and /lists, and you'll get an enumeration of all the lists in the site. And then you can also work more directly with SharePoint list data. So, you'll want to experiment with Graph Explorer to get started and to see what's possible with Microsoft Graph. But let's also take a quick look at a code sample as well. So in this case, I've got a Xamarin application. Xamarin is a great way to build, one application, one code base that works across, Android and iOS and Windows. And so, what it does is it's, uses things like C# and XAML coding to make it easy to go build those applications. Again, one source that does it all. Now, in this case, I've got kind of a hello world, connection to Microsoft Graph. So let me just go start this so you can see what it looks like. So it's going to go boot up the Windows version of this application. There's also Android and iOS versions as well. I'm just going to boot up the Windows version. So you can see I was already signed in, but if I wasn't signed in, I'd have a sign in button. I'd click sign in. It would ask me to enter my credentials. It would do whatever kind of sign in process is appropriate for the organization if they've got, for example, two-factor authentication. And then when it comes back, it'll display some simple profile information. That's, if you're watching my example with Graph Explorer earlier, you'll see that this is kind of, just the /me endpoint that I'm retrieving here. Now let's go take a look at the code. So in my Xamarin application, and basically any application that you're going to use to sort of connect to Microsoft Graph, the first thing you're going to want to do is basically get an authentication token for working with Microsoft Graph. And in this case, there's a library called MSAL, the Microsoft Authentication Library, that's available for Xamarin, and it's available for .NET Core. It's available in a number of different contexts. There's also equivalents in JavaScript as well. And what this is going to do is it's going to say, if the user's already signed in, then go get me their tokens silently. Go fetch their token. And if we've got that, that's great. Let's go call those Graph APIs with the token that we fetched. Now, if this fails, what it's going to do is it's going to say, hey, go ask the user to sign in. And when the user clicks the sign in button, what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, Microsoft Authentication Library, go acquire a token asynchronously. And what this will do is it'll actually pop up the user's sign in experience. And when that succeeds, what will happen is that it'll call my refresh user data function and offer the user an option to sign out. If this succeeds, we know that the user has successfully signed in. So now, when we actually call the refresh user data, you can see that this is a simple HTTP client request. We're just going to make an outbound REST request to graph.microsoft.com/v1.0/me. We're going to add our token to that request so that you can basically authenticate and make sure that you can connect to it. And then we're just going to read the response and process it as JSON. So this is just kind of REST Interop 101 if you've ever done that before. There's also a set of Graph SDKs for libraries like iOS or for example, working with Java or Android or those kinds of things. There's a number of SDKs that are in, some are in beta, some are released, that you can work with to actually bootstrap this process. But our hope is that it's also just simple to interoperate really easily as a REST endpoint. And that's what I'm doing here. So this is just kind of the hello world example. But if I want to make it specific to SharePoint, I can basically do two things. I can come back to my XAML layout for this application, and I can add some simple XAML. So you'll see I'm just adding some stack layout controls with some text values for holding the site URL and for holding a list of SharePoint lists. And then if I actually come back to my Xamarin code, I'm going to add some additional JSON processing information. So what I'm going to do specifically is I'm going to go call this endpoint URL. I'm going to say, go get me the SharePoint site called micam.sharepoint.com/sites/adventure equipment, and then go retrieve this list called organizations. This is the set of organizations that we work with, and go expand the fields, go retrieve all the data that's put into that SharePoint list. And so then what I'm going to do from there is just go display the set of items and the set of organizations that we're working with, basically go fill out that XAML. This is just some really simple code. You can imagine it being a little bit more robust than what you see here, but just to sort of give you an idea for what this hello world working with SharePoint data sample is going to do. So let's go start up our application again. And again, when it starts up, it's going to say, does this user have a sort of a graph token that's fresh and up to date? If yes, then don't ask them to sign in, just automatically go sign them in. And then it's going to go make those REST calls back to Microsoft Graph to go fetch data. So the application's starting up again. And so now it's pulled down that information about me, and it's actually retrieving my site information. And this isn't, obviously this doesn't look good at all. This is just a hello world application. But the idea behind this is now it's pulling in all the information about this set of organizations that our company is working with that's stored in a SharePoint list. And it's just displaying that as items inside of my XAML form. So again, doesn't look very good. You can imagine doing a lot of work with Xamarin Forms to make it look better. But hopefully this gives you an idea of how easy it can be to actually work with SharePoint data wherever your application is, whether it's a Xamarin app, whether it's an iOS app, whether it's a back-end service. If you can sign into Graph, if you can get that token, there's a lot of libraries for doing that, then you can go make some REST calls and get all the best of SharePoint data inside of your applications as well. Now, we have other APIs called REST APIs that are native to SharePoint, and we also have CSOM APIs that are also native to SharePoint. You can call those directly as well. They have a different sort of token scheme, so you need to get your token slightly differently. But what you'll see with those is a broader set of APIs that are supported across more workloads. So there will be certainly times when you're going to want to call into those CSOM and REST APIs to get extended data that goes beyond SharePoint lists and sites. But we're always working to sort of bring more APIs, into Microsoft Graph, and of course work to support those CSOM and REST APIs as well. Now, SharePoint Lists, as I mentioned, is a very key application building block. And so, you can think of this as your, tool for storing structured data inside of SharePoint. We're also improving the user experience of SharePoint and making the lists themselves more robust. For example, for handling large lists, we have intelligent indexing to make it easier to have those lists scale to a large number of items without needing to explicitly plan an indexing strategy. And we're also working to bring a list web part to SharePoint so that you can add simple views of SharePoint lists directly into your pages so that you don't need to build maybe necessarily a web part to do that yourself. So SharePoint lists, take a look at all the capabilities that are exposed for them because they're a very common building block of SharePoint applications. Now, if you want to work with files in Office 365 in SharePoint, there's a number of different ways to access them. So in the same way that if I wanted to work with SharePoint sites, there is a /sites, a sites node inside of Microsoft Graph. There's a node called Drive that's available across OneDrive, SharePoint team sites, and groups that allow you to basically get the root, the root folder, if you will, of SharePoint document libraries, your OneDrive collection, and files that are associated with Office 365 groups. Once you get that Drive pointer, then the set of REST APIs for working with files is really quite consistent across these different types of applications. So that's the beauty of Microsoft Graph, is it makes working with files wherever they may reside very consistent across the board. As we talked about, there is a list API in Microsoft Graph. We showed you a little bit of what that looked like in the application that we built, but you can access that by getting to your SharePoint site, as we saw earlier, asking for the set of lists and then searching for your list through a list identifier. And those list APIs in Microsoft Graph support things like document libraries, so you can get the structured metadata for documents. They also contain support for content types and custom columns as well. So you can really work with rich schema options that are available through content types for very sophisticated document libraries. So we talked a little bit about Microsoft Graph, and so finally just wanted to talk a little bit about some options for logic and processing with SharePoint as well. Webhooks are basically this kind of de facto web standard where basically it's a way for one web service to go tell another web service, hey, something happened inside of my web service that you may want to react to, respond to, or do something with. So it starts with a simple registration protocol where Service A says to Service B, hey, I'm interested in responding to actions that happen inside of you. Here's my endpoint that you should go call. Service B will then call Service A and say, okay, are you able to handle this? Service A says yes, and voila, the webhooks get registered. Now, there are both Microsoft Graph webhooks for working with files and SharePoint native webhooks for working with items more directly. Both of these work the same. It's just a slightly different token that you would use for calling them. But suffice to say, you can work with SharePoint files and SharePoint list items directly through webhooks. Now, one of the nice things is Microsoft Azure has new support for actually calling into Microsoft Graph webhooks through Azure Functions. And Azure Functions are a really easy way to write a little bit of code and have all the details about how that code gets hosted get handled for you. So if you put this together, it makes it really easy to write some code, host it as an Azure function, and then interoperate with things inside of SharePoint and talk to Microsoft Graph. It handles all the registration protocol for you and all of the different sort of token semantics as well. Now, the way that webhooks work is that essentially what will happen is when a change happens, you'll get passed a change token. And so what you'll then immediately want to do is take that change token to call back into SharePoint and say, give me all the sets of files or list items that have changed since this change token has last been issued to me. So in that way, when the webhook fires, you're not getting information directly. All you're really getting is that change notification, and then it's incumbent upon your code to call back into SharePoint and say, what has changed based on this? But the benefit of that is that it makes your code a lot more robust because it can work idempotently so that if it gets called multiple times, it can be very smart to only handle changes as they come in. Now, another option for working with data and changes is through a new application called Microsoft Flow. Well, Flow's been around for about a year, so it's actually not so new anymore, but there's so many new capabilities in Flow, it always feels like a new, fresh application. How about that? So with Flow, there's a number of different connectors that you can pull together to talk to different systems. And so out of the box, you can do things like trigger a set of actions based on when a document gets updated or when a list item gets updated. And you can then automatically connect it just through a out-of-the-box user experience into different types of services. You can combine it with things like your profile information of the person who did the update, and so on and so forth. But with Microsoft Flow as a developer, you can also go create your own custom connectors, your own custom web services that will respond to actions and sort of interoperate with that. So that's another option where you can use Flow as your backend for orchestrating different actions that come together, and then write custom web services, maybe host them on Azure, and connect them as custom connectors into Microsoft Flow. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look at Microsoft Flow, I highly recommend it. And it's not just about end users putting together actions. You can also integrate with it as a developer. And what the other thing you'll see over time is that Microsoft Flow also has deeper integrations with SharePoint itself in terms of the set of things that you can do automatically and from the SharePoint command set. So that was a brief overview of everything that you can do with SharePoint to build applications. We talked about building custom portals and custom communication sites and team sites using tools such as SharePoint Framework to build out custom web parts and to extend them with SharePoint Framework extensions. It takes the best of scripting languages and libraries and pulls them together into one place to make it easy for you. And we also talked about how you can use Microsoft Graph to connect to SharePoint data, things like sites and lists, to pull in information, put it together into applications, whether it's a Xamarin application as we showed you, but also how you can connect to it from services and backend services as well. And specifically, we also talked a bit about Flow as a way to build workflows along with webhooks to go help you react to changes inside of SharePoint. So with that, hopefully you have a sense that the SharePoint developer ecosystem is rapidly evolving and has a modern set of REST services and JavaScript APIs that you can take advantage of as a developer. We have a lot of content for you on dev.office.com/SharePoint and also the patterns and practices resources that I mentioned earlier. So if you just go to dev.office.com/SharePoint, you'll see your documentation and jump starts for actually going ahead and building your first web part, building your first SharePoint Framework extension, or talking to Microsoft Graph. So I encourage you to go there and check everything out that we have available for you. So with that, happy coding as you start building out your own SharePoint Framework and SharePoint developer experiences. Thank you.